Good afternoon. I'd like to thank Bill and the board for inviting me to join you this afternoon. As many of you may know, Bill is an avid birder. I'm just curious how many of you are also birders? Any amateur astronomers? How about herpetologists? Since this is the Cochise County Historical Society, I assume that most of you enjoy history. Who has ever heard of B.J.D. Irwin? Mike Eberhart wanted me to make sure that you knew that Irwin was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions during the Bascom affair here in Cochise County. Here's Irwin's Medal of Honor, awarded in 1893, hanging from an 1896 ribbon. And here's Irwin's redesigned 1904 Medal of Honor. And here's the reverse of the medal, near Apache Pass. Although we'll talk about Irwin's Medal of Honor later, the focus of my talk is on the contributions Irwin made to the Smithsonian Institution while he was stationed in Arizona before the Civil War. The most popular room in the Smithsonian's Museum of Natural History is the one that hosts the Hope Diamond. Every once in a while the crowd will thin, and against the far wall you can see another iconic artifact which prior to the Hope Diamond had been the most popular attraction since its arrival at the Smithsonian in 1863. The Tucson meteorite is perhaps the most famous meteorite in the world. It's actually made up of two fragments. The smaller fragment is sometimes referred to as the Carlton, after James Carlton. The larger fragment has been known by several names, including the ring meteorite, because of its unique shape. Together, they're known as the Tucson meteorite. On one visit to the Smithsonian, I reached my camera behind the meteorite and took this picture. If you look carefully, you can still see a faint whitewash label from the 1880s. And here you can see the letters ORITE and ARIZ. The Smithsonian's 1886 annual report still showed a painted label on the reverse side, identifying it as the Irwin meteorite. But the meteorite was only one of dozens of specimens of natural history that Irwin arranged to ship back to the Smithsonian. Irwin altogether sent 12 boxes of specimens to the Smithsonian, not all of which made it. This afternoon, I'll share with you the story of Irwin's 12 boxes. I've been researching the life of Bernard John Dowling Irwin longer than I care to think about. In the summer of 2003, I had the good fortune of meeting the great-grandson of Dr. Irwin, John Irwin. Like Dr. Irwin, John was well over 6 feet tall. Unfortunately, he passed away this summer. But I will always be indebted to him for his friendship and sharing access to his great-grandfather's papers and artifacts. Here, for example, are Irwin's spurs. In accordance with John's wishes, most of his papers will go to the Army Heritage Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. But his Medal of Honor will be going to the Smithsonian. A brief overview of Irwin's life. He was born in Ireland in 1829. And here's a view of Roundford House, where Irwin was born. Nothing has changed in 200 years. He immigrated to New York City at the age of 16 with his family. And this is New York Harbor in 1845. And this is the manifest for the ship Yorkshire. You can see that here's Baird, and he arrived with 13 others, including his mother and father, 7 brothers and sisters, his grandmother, and 2 nannies. A good Irish Catholic family. For the next 8 years, he pursued his medical education in New York City. Irwin was tutored by Dr. John Whitaker, one of New York City's most acclaimed teachers of medicine. And I've always thought Whitaker's skull and crossbones letterhead was a great advertisement for a medical teacher. While he was a medical student, Irwin enlisted as a private in the 7th Regiment of the New York National Guard, and he got his first taste of conflict when he participated in the infamous Astor Place riot. And here he is marching in Washington Square. This is him. You can still see at age 21, he already had a mustache. And you can ask me after the talk how I know it's him. Irwin graduated from the New York Medical College on East 13th Street in February 1851. And here's the class of 1851 showing B.J.D. Irwin literally at the top of his class. And here's the faculty. Horace Green, the father of ear, nose, and throat surgery. John Whitaker, Irwin's mentor. Edwin Hamilton Davis, who gathered the largest collection of prehistoric Indian artifacts in the United States. Benjamin Fordyce Barker, who brought the hypodermic syringe to America and was later President Grant's personal physician. R. Ogden Doremus, who gave us Mr. Clean and other chlorine disinfectants. John Murray Carnican, professor of surgery, who once bragged he could amputate a leg at the thigh in 12 seconds. And way down here with the janitor, William P. Blake, teacher in chemistry. William Phipps Blake went on to become the only territorial geologist for Arizona. His notebooks are in the Historical Society in Tucson. This painting was done by Stephen Testa, the former executive officer of the California State Mining and Geology Board. Blake shows up frequently during this talk, and Stephen once did a portrait of Irwin for me. I told Stephen to make sure that he showed Irwin's flaming red hair and bright blue eyes. Irwin did his postgraduate training at the Emigrants Hospital on Ward's Island in New York, the largest hospital in the world during epidemics of typhus, cholera, and smallpox. Irwin took the notoriously difficult Army Medical Department exam. Only 20% passed. The good news is he passed. The bad news was he was 15th out of 15th and had to wait 2 years for an opening. Rather than wait, in 1855, he signed on as a contract surgeon and accompanied Colonel Bonneville and 600 recruits to New Mexico. After sundry adieu and parting drinks. I've always enjoyed this entry in Irwin's diary. We embarked on board the steamship Prometheus with some 600 recruits destined for New Mexico and Texas. Irwin landed at Corpus Christi and then crossed the Trans-Pecos of Texas, stopping at Fort Ewell, Camp Lancaster, Fort Davis, and stopping also at Eagle Spring, where I'd like to read an excerpt from his diary for January 3rd. I will here record a famous shot I made yesterday. With one charge of small shot, I killed 162 reed birds, which Major Bryce picked up and counted. I suspect few of those birds would have made good specimens. He was then on to El Paso, then Albuquerque, Santa Fe, before being sent up to Fort Union. Here's a sketch of Fort Union in the 1850s, looking east towards the Turkey Mountains from the commanding officer's house. This was the hospital. And here's what Fort Union looks like today from the same site. The Fort Union that is open to the public is up here, and this is where the hospital was. Irwin clearly had a good time at Fort Union. This is a very fine post situated in a delightful part of the country with magnificent climate and delightful hunting. You should be here to join us on a wolf chase some fine morning. There is a certain kind of bird which we hunt here with great gusto. It's called grouse by the Mexicans. It's very plentiful and is usually served with a hot sauce. Speaking of grouse, a subgroup of grouse is the ptarmigan. In this 2015 article, Clayton Brown and Sandy Williams point out that this rare ptarmigan was first reported by Irwin, and that the current location of the specimen is unknown. As we'll see in a minute, it's possible that Irwin's ptarmigan is at the bottom of the Missouri River. As an oh, by the way, Ben Deere was one of Irwin's protégés. All good things must come to an end, and after only 2 months at Fort Union, Irwin was given orders to Fort Defiance, in the heart of the Navajo country. This is looking west at Benito Canyon. And here's Fort Defiance today. It's still an integral part of the Navajo Nation. Irwin's commanding officer in 1856 was a remarkable individual named Henry Lane Kendrick, and I'm surprised that no one has written a biography of Kendrick. He graduated from West Point in 1835 and was appointed assistant professor of chemistry. Anybody who went to West Point in the next 10 years before the Mexican War would be his student, including Sherman, Grant, Longstreet, and Ewell. In 1847, he was sent into the War with Mexico, where he was brevetted for gallant and meritorious conduct. And in 1848, he was sent back to New York City, where he reestablished himself with America's growing scientific community. And then in 1852, he assumed command of Fort Defiance. Among Kendrick's correspondents was Spencer Fullerton Baird, who helped to found the Museum of Natural History for the Smithsonian. Baird was a collector of collectors. He would recruit anyone traveling west to help him collect specimens. He was particularly interested in cultivating Army medical officers to assist him in his efforts. He was also an incredible correspondent, writing over 3,000 letters a year. And almost all of Baird's outgoing letters are preserved in these so-called copybooks. Unfortunately, they are almost all illegible. The ink has bled, the thin tissue papers stick together, leaving big holes, and what's worse, all that's available to researchers are photocopies made almost 50 years ago. Baird wrote this letter on October 9th, 1857, asking Irwin to start collecting for the museum. And if you think reading microfilm is hard, try reading 100 pages of this stuff. Mr. W.P. Blake writes to us from Santa Fe that he has sent you cans provided by the institution with the request that you will use them in procuring such specimens of natural history as may come under your notice. This is the same Blake we've met before. Blake had gotten a gig with Beale's camel expedition to find a road that eventually became Route 66. Blake got sick along the way in Santa Fe and left a rain gauge to be sent to Irwin at Fort Defiance. Blake's notebooks are in the Arizona Historical Society in Tucson. Left one rain gauge with Thornton to be returned by him to the Smithsonian, and one with Captain Gibson to be sent up to Fort Defiance in the box of cans for natural history specimens for Dr. B.J.D. Irwin, who was the physician there. Irwin was in the 13th Street School with Dr. Whitaker when I was there. There's also a pot of arsenics. Baird went on to recruit Irwin as one of his collectors. I write now to beg that you will do us the very great favor to make us such collections as you can for us, as we are very anxious to complete our proposed Museum of North American Zoology. For reasons which we'll soon see, I call Irwin's first box 0. In September 1857, Irwin wrote a sweat-stained letter to Baird. Sir, I have the honor to inform you that I have this day sent to Professor Kendrick one box of various specimens of natural history collected in the vicinity of this post. He then goes on to list some of the specimens, consisting of a number of skulls, reptiles, a bottle of insects, a number of birds, salted and unsalted, and whether Irwin's lost ptarmigan was one of these birds is not known. 2 months later, Baird wrote back to Irwin, Dear Sir, I regret to learn by a letter from Professor Kendrick that the box of specimens sent to him went to the bottom of the Missouri River. All had been on board the steamer Tropic, snagged on the Missouri. As, however, you are better prepared now than before, I hope that the next batch will have better luck and reach us safely. It would be 6 months before Irwin received Baird's letter, about the tropic. The sinking of the tropic made national news. Over 400 steamboats sank in the Missouri River in the 19th century, many of which had valuable treasures such as gold and whiskey. Turns out that 130 years later, somebody actually found the wreck of the Tropic while looking for that treasure. The Hawley family is most famous for excavating an intact Missouri steamboat named Arabia, which is now one of the most popular attractions in Kansas City. Because the river shifted, many of the wrecks ended up far from the current shoreline. And here's the Arabia being dug up in 1988. The contents of Arabia were perfectly preserved. In the 50 miles east of Kansas City alone, 50 ships went down. In the process of looking for Arabia, they found several other ships, including the Tropic. They were looking for the William Baird, which sunk with $5,000 in gold and whiskey. Not all the wrecks were valuable. On the first day they were searching for William Baird, they got a signal on their magnetometer. They started digging. They found a steamboat, but it wasn't the right one. It was the Tropic, which they didn't think was valuable, so they left it alone. And here's where the Tropic probably sits today. Irwin's next duty station was Fort Buchanan, south of Tucson. He arrived the day after Christmas, 1857. And here's Fort Buchanan's parade ground, looking south. The cottonwood in the distance may have been there 150 years ago. And this is looking west from the possible site of the post hospital. Like most of Buchanan, mesquite runs wild. And in the distance you can see Mount Wrightson, nicknamed Old Baldy, after Irwin's new commanding officer, Richard Stoddard Ewell. And these are the remains of Ewell's quarters at Fort Buchanan, taken from the site of Irwin's quarters. When I first visited with the property owner, I asked him if he knew he was buying a fort when he bought the place. He replied the fort was 500 yards to the east, to the left. I explained we were probably standing right on top of Irwin's dining room. He put up a flag and asked me to write words for a plaque. And I've provided a copy of the words so you can read them later. Richard Stoddard Ewell was a West Point graduate and noted cavalryman who distinguished himself in the Mexican War and later in expeditions against the Navajos. In a letter to his niece, Ewell referred to Irwin as an Irishman, red-headed and hot-tempered. It was a while before Baird's letter about the Tropic made it to Buchanan, and Irwin was annoyed. I regret to learn that the collections in natural history, which I made at Fort Defiance, were entirely lost while en route to Washington. I'm extremely sorry for this, as it is not in my power to replace them, having left Defiance October last. Irwin was miffed at Baird's cavalier response to the loss of what had been, for Irwin, several months of hard work in the desert around Fort Defiance. Perusing that the Boundary Commission, under Major Emery, made collections of almost all kinds to be found in this place, I am somewhat disinclined to do much until I know something more on the subject. But Irwin wasn't a total jerk. However, I have made some collections since my arrival and will be glad to extend my labors in any direction which you may direct. Irwin never rode alone when collecting specimens. He always had at least one enlisted man to assist him. Baird would later try to transfer John Xantos, a hospital steward from Fort Tejon, California, to help him. Xantos was one of Baird's most prodigious collectors. But Irwin had already found someone to help him who would eventually outshine Irwin and many others in the annals of ornithology. Charles Bendire was a German immigrant. He enlisted from New York in 1854 and was assigned to Company D, 1st Dragoons, Ewell's company. The 20-year-old private was fascinated with Irwin's collections of birds, animals, and which sometimes stacked up in Irwin's office. Edgar Mearns, the noted naturalist, wrote, "More important than any of Dr. Irwin's contributions of notes and specimens was his early training of Charles Bendire in the exact methods of scientific observation. Bendire was later stationed at Fort Lowell, where he discovered Bendire's thrasher, and his life histories of North American birds is considered a classic. In July, Baird wrote to Irwin and encouraged him to keep on collecting. I do most earnestly hope that you will set to work at a systematic collection of all the animals in your vicinity, without the least reference to what have been done by others. The Boundary Commission collection, though throwing some light on the subject, is far from being sufficient for these purposes. Baird went on to make sure that Irwin understood what his priorities were. If there are any wild turkeys about Fort Buchanan, I wish you would skin a few pairs. Eggs of all birds of all kinds are highly desirable for our work to embrace eggs from all North American species. Baird went on to suggest that Irwin use the overland mail. As you are on a line of mail coaches, could you not send in small specimens from time to time by mail? I suppose the coaches would carry quite small light boxes at a moderate charge as far as San Antonio. Baird was referring to the San Diego and San Antonio mail, also known as the Jackass mail. In September 1858, the Butterfield Overland Mail was still constructing its stations in Arizona, and the Dragoon Springs station would be the site of one of Irwin's most famous exploits. Irwin was the subject of many articles in True West magazine, including this one from 1970. 100 Hours of Terror, Mercy Express to Dragoon Springs. This is Silas St. John, who was working on constructing the station at Dragoon Springs in September 1858, when he was brutally attacked by 3 Mexicans who killed his co-workers and left him for dead. And this is Irwin, who saved his life. 6 days after the attack, a wagon arrived and a messenger was sent to fetch Irwin. Irwin later wrote about his experience. On the 16th of September, 1858, I was requested to visit one of the stations of the Overland Mail, where a number of men were reported to have been dangerously wounded. I set out at once. Irwin arrived to find his patient barely alive, his arm almost completely severed. After a careful examination, I saw it would be impossible to make any effort to save the arm. I therefore determined to remove it at once. Chloroform was unavailable. The celerity with which the operation was performed, and the fortitude and excellent disposition of the patient, saved him from anything like protracted suffering. Remember, one of Irwin's professors was John Murray Connerkin, who had amputated a leg at the thigh in 12 seconds. Irwin then arranged for St. John to be transported back to Fort Buchanan to convalesce. 3 weeks later, St. John was seen walking around the fort in good spirits. A week after the attack, the first westbound stage of the Butterfield Overland Mail left St. Louis, ushering in a new era of transcontinental travel. I want to set the stage, no pun intended, for this period in Arizona history, the late 1850s, in the area that would become Cochise County. This map was endorsed by Sylvester Mowry as being the most elaborate and correct map of Arizona yet completed. And yet it annoys me that the Santa Rita Mountains are shown east of the Sorota Creek and the Santa Rita Mine, which was in the Santa Rita Mountains, including Mowry's own mine, the Patagonian. So I've removed them for this talk. Here's the Overland Mail Trail from San Francisco to St. Louis. And here's the Dragoon Springs Station, which was a fortified station, as was Apache Pass and Steens Peak stations. They had stone walls 12 feet high and gun ports. Tucson and Cienega were unfortified. And the reason for the fortified stations is that the Butterfield Trail ran right through the heart of Apachuria. Here's where the Carreters were, the Pinals, and the Chiricahuas. Needless to say, Butterfield hadn't asked permission when running his line, but keeping the Transcontinental Mail open would become a national priority. This was September 1858. Both the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Army were asked to make nice with the Chiricahua. Cochise, the head of one of the Chiricahua bands, was getting heat from Mexico for his raids into that country, and not wanting a two-front war, Cochise was amenable to overtures from the whites. In late December, Michael Steck, the Indian agent, met with Cochise at Apache Pass, and a few weeks later, the military met with Cochise at the same place. Here's where Fort Buchanan was located, and this is where a new fort, to be called Fort Breckinridge, would be built. This is not the current border with New Mexico. Kelly's map was a map of the Confederate territory of Arizona. This was a boundary line that ran 1 mile east of the stage station at Apache Pass. This is Ewell County, not Arizona County, and here are the approximate borders of today's Cochise County. On January 16, 1859, Irwin wrote a letter to Sylvester Mallory, Arizona's delegate to Congress. Dr. Steck is here. Ewell and myself will leave here tomorrow for the Playa de los Pinos, where the Coyoteros and Chiricahuas are to meet this very worthy father, who has come out with a supply of presents for them, as a reward for their zeal in deprecating on our citizens. Perhaps it is all right. Obviously, Irwin wasn't a fan of Steck's policy. Since this was supposed to be a peaceful mission, Steck didn't want to upset the Apaches, so he convinced Ewell to take an escort of only 6 dragoons instead of his normal 45. This is the valley of Apache Pass, and this is the placard that's there showing the different landmarks. And this is probably where the stage station was. On January 25th, 1859, Ewell, Steck, and Irwin arrived at Apache Pass. While Ewell negotiated with Cochise, Irwin wandered around, possibly with Bendir, collecting specimens for the Smithsonian. It reminds me of the movie Master and Commander, where Russell Crowe plays the captain and Paul Bettany plays the doctor, who, while everyone else is preparing for the next battle, the doctor is out wandering around measuring the necks of turtles. This is the front page of the New York Times while Ewell and Irwin were at Apache Pass. Dateline, Fort Buchanan, Tuesday, January 25th, 1859. The Apaches have just commenced killing whites. At the same time this party of Apaches were murdering these discharged soldiers, Captain Ewell, the Indian agent Steck, was making a treaty with them. Some anxiety is felt for Captain E., who is out with only 6 men, and Dr. Irwin. I don't have anything against the New York Times, but just to show that you can't believe everything you read, this says, the men killed were on their way home to the States with their families, accompanied by Sergeant Ryan and his family. Ryan made his escape, but his wife was carried off captive. Well, the true story is that none of the soldiers were married. They were probably AWOL and had spent the night drinking with some Pinal Indians who later turned on them. There were no families, and Sergeant Ryan, who escaped, was later court-martialed for stealing from the fort. Irwin had been at Fort Buchanan a year. He was ready to start shipping his specimens again. He was still burned out by his experience with the tropic and decided not to put all his eggs in one basket. No pun intended. I have this day turned over to the quartermaster's department one large trunk containing ornithological specimens collected by me at this place. There is not as many as I would wish to send, but the fact is I'm afraid to send too much at once for fear of accident. I have specimens in the various branches of natural history amounting to 1,500 to 2,000, but I prefer sending them in small batches. The great trouble is to get anything either to or from this country. You can judge the difficulty and uncertainty when I tell you that I have just received a microscope which I left at Defiance more than 14 months ago, and which has been coming ever since. I have had between here and San Antonio, which has been en route from New York since May last. A couple of months later, Irwin sent 3 more boxes. I have this day sent to you 3 boxes, numbers 2, 3, and 4, containing specimens of the natural history of this vicinity. Number 1, containing bird specimens, I sent about 2 months ago. Irwin tried again to explain to Baird that he had inadequate supplies to prepare his specimens. They are not in as good order as I could wish, as I have no means of preserving them. Arsenic, I have none. I wish I could get some materials to prepare and preserve the specimens that I collect, as it is very expensive to buy alcohol out here. The artificial mixture Godby's solution does not work well in this warm climate. Speaking of climate, Irwin kept a detailed weather report while he was in Arizona. Jerry Arndt of Butterfield fame always talks about primary sources. Well, I want to share a couple of unusual primary sources with you this afternoon. How many of you are history writers? Setting the scene is always important, including the weather. As you know, 19th century medical officers were required to keep weather reports. And a friend of mine, Mark Stromberg, introduced me to the Forts database of weather reports, which are a source of fascinating historical information. It's maintained by the Midwestern Regional Climate Center in Purdue, Indiana. You can see the green dots are 1851 to 1865, and the green dots and the blue dots are 1866 to 1880. And so here is Fort Buchanan, a green dot, and this is Fort Breckinridge, and this is Fort Lowell, Fort Bowie, and Fort Apache. And way up here is Prescott and Fort Whipple. So here's the weather report for June 1859. In addition to temperatures and rainfall, the remarks section contains interesting notes. Thermometer 125, and we thought this was a hot year. And here's a note about light sprinkling of rain, thunder, and lightning. And in September 1858, Irwin noted, brilliant comet in the west-northwest, tail about 45 degrees long, visible every morning, size about that of Venus. This was Donati's comet, and not only Irwin saw it. This sketch was done by William Hayes Hilton, who was visiting Arizona in the fall of 1858. And Jerry Arndt says this is not the Butterfield because no one ever slept on the Butterfield stage. A year later, on September 2nd, 1859, Irwin made this entry in his daily log. Onset of brilliant aurora borealis from 11 p.m. until 3 a.m. Focus of rays about 4 degrees. When I first read this entry, I thought, that's strange. An aurora visible in Arizona? Turns out that this was the Carrington event, the most intense geomagnetic storm in recorded history. Across the world, telegraph wires burned. Imagine what would happen today. This was just one of a series of events that would result in the coming year to become known as the Year of the Meteor. Irwin had sent his first 4 boxes of 1859 using the Army's quartermaster department. He still didn't know where they were. Baird had written to Irwin that he had made special arrangements with the Butterfield so Irwin decided to try the Overland Mail Company. Today I send a large box, number 5, of birds for Overland Mail directed to you. I know you will be pleased with this collection, but the preparation is bad, as I had no materials until recently. Irwin got quick feedback from Baird on his box of birds sent by the Overland Mail. I have now the pleasure of reporting that they arrived here yesterday. The collection is a very interesting one indeed. It adds considerably to our knowledge of the distribution of species, etc. The rarest and most unexpected is the blue jay. I'm very sorry to report, however, that the greatest part of the specimens were utterly destroyed by the larvae of the beetle, so that the head, back, or wings fall off at a touch. None of these was preserved at all with arsenic. Seeming to forget that Irwin had no preservation supplies when he sent the specimens, Baird provided him with advice. Will you permit me to suggest some points in regard to the skinning of birds for preservation? It is essential to remove the skin, apply the arsenic freely so as to make it penetrate all the cavities, smear the skin well, and I defy the bugs. In reply, Irwin wrote back to Baird, you are correct in your surmise about my want of arsenic, as I did not have anything but salt. Irwin tried to explain to his desk-bound mentor the realities of collecting specimens while accompanying troops in the field. It is often somewhat difficult to preserve a specimen properly, as it may be procured when I am away from the fort and devoid of all kinds of preservatives for securing it. I have got some few specimens in this way, and the only thing I had about me was a penknife, a newspaper to stuff them with, and the heat of the sun to dry them with. I am but a poor hand at taxidermy. Box number 5 still had a numbered packing list, and many of the birds are still in the back rooms of the Smithsonian. Let's see how bad they really were. Anybody care to take a whack at identifying this specimen? You can see there's been some damage, but after 150 years, the colors are still intact. This specimen was collected by Irwin on March 21st near Fort Buchanan. Irwin misidentified the specimen as a chaffinch instead of a vermilion flycatcher that had migrated north from South America. And here you can see somebody at the Smithsonian has relabeled his chaffinch. This is the Mexican jay, which Baird thought was so rare. And again, you can see it here on the inventory list. This label says this is a Tyrannus falciferans, the scientific name for the Cason's kingbird. This specimen is labeled as a Poecilia, or Wilson's warbler, collected on 24 March. And here's the specimen collected on 24 March. I'm not even going to try and pronounce this one. It's a subspecies of the red-winged blackbird. The staff of the Smithsonian didn't bring out all of his birds. A variety of hawks shot near the Chiricahua Mountains, November 1858. No measurement could be taken. In early November 1858, Ewell had left Buchanan on a 10-day scout. In a letter to his niece dated November 14th, he wrote that he had been campaigning peacefully for the last 2 weeks. And here are the post returns for November 1858. You can see that both Ewell and Irwin were on detached service from the 3rd through the 13th. And here's Irwin's entry in the registers for medical officers in the National Archives. November 14th, reports having been about with a scouting party in the Chiricahua Mountains from November 3rd to November 13th. An eastward scout would have put both of them in the southern Chiricahuas, not more than 30 miles from here. And I'd like to point out that November 10th, 1858 was a month before Agent Michael Steck first met with Cochise in December. No measurements could be taken, probably because Irwin had blasted the birds too much. But Irwin could do more than blast birds out of the sky. He was an accomplished marksman. Here's this note from the Weekly Arizonian. On the 6th instant, Dr. Irwin, United States Army of Fort Buchanan, killed 2 antelope at a single shot with a Colt's carbine, the distance being over 300 yards. By January 1860, 5 boxes had been sent, but only 1 had been received. In addition to Indian depredations, there was a lot of political turmoil going on the eve of the Civil War. Earlier, we looked at Kelly's map of 1860, showing Ewell's County. That was the Confederate view of Arizona Territory. On January 1st, 1860, the federal territory of New Mexico in Santa Fe created Arizona County, which was intended to appease the residents of the Gaston Purchase who felt neglected by Santa Fe. And this is where the current boundaries of Cochise County are. On March 15th, Irwin wrote to Baird announcing he was sending another box of specimens, these preserved in alcohol. I hope they will arrive safe, as it is a hard, long road to send bottles over the overland mail. Irwin's bottles did arrive safely. Don't know if these are the original bottles, but here they are during my visit to the Smithsonian in the fall of 2008. In 2016, when I wrote an article about Fort Buchanan for the Journal of Arizona History, I included this picture because I thought the rattlesnake was cool. I added the specimen number just to be fancy. After the article was sent to be published, I discovered I had the wrong number. Instead of 005-00022, it should have been 005-027. So I debated about whether to change it or not, but decided, who's going to notice? Turns out Mike Cardwell noticed. In this article, he and his colleagues discuss how specimen 00527 is actually the type specimen for the Mojave rattlesnake and was mislabeled years ago. Mike has gone on to write a book about this, and here he talks about specimen numbers. And I just thought it made a neat looking photo. Who knew? But Irwin not only sent back birds and snakes. In a letter to Baird, Irwin wrote, I enclose you a specimen of what the Mexicans call golondrinera, a variety of swallowwort which grows abundantly all over this country, and which I wish you would go get to Professor Torrey or Gray to identify. I'm about to publish an essay on its properties as an antidote to the poison of the rattlesnake. I've made several experiments with it this season. Torrey wrote back and identified the plant as Euphorbia prostata, and Irwin published his article in the American Journal of Medical Science. According to Henrietta's Herbal homepage, Euphorbia prostata, swallowwort, is a plant growing in the southwestern portions of the United States and Mexico and is one of the many so-called specifics against the bite of the rattlesnake. The plant was formerly used as a folk remedy for snake bites, hence the common name rattlesnake weed. However, the species is not proven to be medically effective in treating rattlesnake venom. Nonetheless, it impressed Libby Custer, who wrote about it in her book, Following the Guidance. This reminds me of one of our surgeons, Dr. B.J.D. Irwin, of our Army, General Custer's warm personal friend. I remember the pleasure with which he discovered at our first post at Fort Riley a weed that he had not supposed grew there, which was an antidote for a snake bite. He held this little ugly scrap of vegetation in his hand, as if he had in his possession a rare work of art. It was to him that I was indebted for my first insight into the fervor and enthusiasm of his profession. And this picture by Jerry Thomas captures the rides that the Irwins and the Custers took while Custer was at Fort Riley waiting for his court-martial in 1867. In May 1860, Irwin sent another box, this one number 7. I'm going to Tucson and Aravipa Canyon tomorrow to see the location of our new post, Fort Breckenridge. I bring a box, number 7, containing birds, etc., which I will forward by overland mail. There is a specimen of the mountain lobo, wolf, which is very large, as big as a good-sized bear. The same letter had a discussion of Irwin's next project, box number 8. The gentleman who owns that specimen of meteor at Tucson has kindly presented it to me. It weighs about 1,000 pounds, and the freight on it to Guaymas would be about $40 or $50. Irwin was responding to a recent letter from Baird, which had asked, what would be the cost of getting the big Tucson meteorite down to Guaymas, and what would the owner ask for the specimen? Are there any smaller ones to be had? In the winter of 1859 to 1860, Baird had meteors, comets, and other celestial happenings on his mind. The aurora borealis, which Irwin had witnessed in September, had been followed in November by a huge fireball visible throughout the Northeast. The two events resulted in dozens of articles about meteors and shooting stars flowing across the desks of scientific editors around the world, including Baird and his boss at the Smithsonian, Joseph Henry. A year later, continued celestial events would prompt Walt Whitman to write his poem, Year of the Meteors. The late Richard Willey wrote a fascinating account of the Tucson meteorite, which was published by the Smithsonian in 1985. And a much more definitive history is his unpublished version, available in the University of Arizona. Everything you would ever want to know about the meteorite is in this article, so I'll only give you a brief summary. The first description of the meteor was in 1850. And 2 years later, the famous entomologist John LeConte, while wandering through the Southwest in search of beetles, came upon not one, but 2 anvils. In 1852, John Russell Bartlett, on his boundary search, sketched the meteorite. And this picture is from Kathy Rambo's great book, Dark Flight, The Hunt for the Tucson Ring Meteorite. In 1854, Lieutenant John G. Park, on his railroad survey of the 32nd parallel, wrote, that in the garrison is of a very peculiar form, being annular and somewhat like a signet ring. Park sent small chips taken from the meteorite to be analyzed. It is to be hoped that some of our enterprising U.S. topographical engineers will yet be able to persuade the owners to part with it and bring it to this country. No one offered, and after the Mexican garrison was abandoned in 1856, the anvil sat undisturbed, gathering dust, until Baird asks Irwin about it almost 4 years later. When Irwin saw the meteorite for the first time, he may have thought the ring was already spoken for, referring to it as famous. In December 1857, I took post at Fort Buchanan and shortly afterwards visited Tucson to examine the famous Irwin, which I had found hidden away amongst the rubbish of an obscure alley. No person had claimed it, and it was looked upon as a curious but valueless object. It wasn't until Baird asked him about the meteorite in the spring of 1860 that Irwin actually sought out obtaining the meteorite for the Smithsonian. In early June, Irwin finally heard from Baird that the boxes sent a year earlier had arrived. After long delays, I have the pleasure of announcing the arrival of the 3 boxes, 2, 3, and 4, announced in yours of April 15, 1859. The specimens in the boxes came in better than I feared with their long delay. The insects I will turn over to LeConte, who will doubtless be much pleased with them. Mr. Blake happened here when the minerals were unpacked and saw much to interest him. Altogether, the collection is one of very great importance, and although delayed in arriving, it's especially welcome. But Baird was never satisfied. I hope you have had it in your power to procure the eggs of the quails of Arizona, 1 or more of the species at least. Irwin swore that he would get Baird his eggs. Throughout the spring and summer of 1860, Cochise and his band had been acting out, so Ewell rode to Apache Pass in June to confront him. And although the post returns don't list Irwin on the June 6th scout, there is no doubt that he accompanied Ewell. On June 9th, while Ewell was negotiating with Cochise, Irwin was out looking for eggs, which are still today in the Smithsonian. And here you can see the quail eggs, June 9th, and found in the Chiricahuas. A few weeks later, Ewell returned to Apache Pass, and this time Irwin was listed. In September, Irwin sent off the eggs he had collected in June. I send you by this mail a small box of eggs, all that I could collect during the year. When I get the bill for the meteor, I will send it to you. I have been very ill of late, and am hardly able to write. Irwin had come down with malaria, and it would be months before he was completely well. It wasn't until February of 1861 that Irwin was able to finally write Baird again, and a lot had happened in the meantime. Ewell had returned east and would join the Confederacy. The dragoons had been transferred from Buchanan to Breckinridge. They were replaced by infantry, who most of the time had to hop on mules if they wanted to chase Indians. Irwin had been burned out after 6 years in the Department of New Mexico and was making plans to return east. On February 3rd, Irwin wrote to Baird, I owe you an apology in not having replied to your letters, but I was on temporary duty at Fort Breckinridge and did not get them until a few days ago. I am glad to inform you that the meteor was within 2 days of Guaymas when last I heard of it, and I have quite a large box of miscellaneous specimens to send, which I'm thinking of forwarding via Texas in the next few days. Irwin was overly optimistic in his assessment of the meteor's progress. He had turned it over to a Mexican freighter named Ainza, who only made it as far as his home in Hermosillo, Mexico, more than 80 miles from the Guaymas, where it would sit for another 2 years. He did manage to send a shipment of specimens, as well as some of his personal effects, just before he was called away on a rescue mission to Apache Pass. This is a view looking east from Apache Pass. I'm not going to go into the Bascom affair in too much detail, since it's probably the most well-known incident to happen in Cochise County. I will share that Irwin did not stop wandering off in search of specimens. This is the first page of Bascom's original report. Feeling confident that they had the boy, I captured 6 Indians and told the chief Cochise that I would hold them as hostages until he brought in the boy. He denied having taken the boy. Well, we all know the rest of the story. Bascom found himself in a rapidly deteriorating situation when Cochise went on the offensive, and he sent out for help, and Irwin arrived to take care of the wounded. After taking care of the wounded, Irwin went out wandering again. Unfortunately, Irwin found more than eggs. Dr. Irwin discovered about 4 miles from the station the bodies of the 4 prisoners where they had been mutilated and murdered by the Indians. Irwin and Bascom were commended for their actions by the commander of the department. This was Irwin's copy. The department commander directs that you will publicly express to Dr. Irwin and Lieutenant Bascom his approbation of the excellent conduct of those officers and of the troops under their commands in the operations against the Apaches during the last month. And this commendation would later be used in Irwin's Medal of Honor package. 30 years later, Irwin was awarded a Medal of Honor for distinguished gallantry in action against hostile Indians. His action is the first for which a Medal of Honor was awarded. Irwin's citation has always focused on his combatant role rather than on his original mission to provide aid to his wounded comrades. Here's the reverse of his original medal: for distinguished gallantry in action against hostile Indians. But he never shied away from the combatant aspects of his mission. In his original report, he wrote, after crossing the Playa de los Pinos on the 10th, and while en route, I discovered a herd of cattle being driven by Indians at some miles. My infantry escort being mounted on mules, I immediately started in pursuit. And this is the Alkali Flat with the Dascabias Mountains in the distance. After a hard chase, we captured a Kayotero chief and 2 warriors. I bound the prisoners and with the cattle delivered them to Lieutenant Bascom at Apache Pass. And this is the entrance where Irwin and his 12 comrades and 3 prisoners rode into Apache Pass. He was still thinking that Cochise was waiting with 500 warriors. And those are not the Dascabias. This is the western entrance of Apache Pass. Irwin described it as a long and tortuous passage. And you can see as it goes up through, following the Butterfield along a narrow defile, and then up over to here where he came upon the massacre site. This is the sign at the wagon massacre site where the mutilated bodies of 8 teamsters were found. When Irwin arrived at the station, he tended to the wounded, including Cochise's brother. Cochise had fled a few days earlier. In studying Irwin's role in the Basque affair, I've always preferred to focus on his original mission. I left the 9th and proceeded to the Chiricahua Mountains to render my professional services to the wounded men belonging to the command of Lieutenant G.N. Bascom. The fact that comrades were surrounded by unusual danger and that several of them were suffering from wounds were the motives that prompted the efforts to fly to their assistance, even at the imminent risk of self-sacrifice. And this is Irwin in 1896 wearing his Medal of Honor. And in 1933, Irwin's daughter Amy painted his portrait using a 1904 photograph. You can clearly see his new Medal of Honor. And these are the medals Irwin is wearing. After the Bascom affair, everything went downhill quickly. Cochise went on a rampage. The department commander was called back east, and as relief, William Loring resigned after a month and joined the Confederacy. Butterfield lost his contract, and the mail route was moved north through Colorado. And Irwin's box, number 10, sent just before he left for the Bascom affair, never made it through Texas. I fear the rebels will appropriate everything, as they are little better than highwaymen out that way. Irwin's collecting days were over. It's impossible to go about saving large parties, and then there's little time for straggling. I've been using my utmost efforts to secure some turkey eggs, but so far without success. I will beg, buy, or steal if it should be possible. Although his collecting days were over, his fighting days were not. Irwin had one more run-in with Cochise on June 22nd, when he and Bascom and Patty Graydon chased Cochise into the Whetstone Mountains. As Sergeant Daniel Robinson recounted in his article, Another Apache Affair, the surgeon had a narrow escape. One of them had been giving him pointed attention. Graydon happened to be near the surgeon, and as quick as thought, raised his rifle and silenced the Apache forever. This illustration is an edited version of Joe Beeler's original. A month later, in July 1861, Fort Buchanan was abandoned. With 2 companies of dragoons, 2 companies of infantry, 40 dependents, and 30 wagons of goods, they headed east to the Rio Grande. Box 11 was another box that never made it to its destination. If you've been counting, this is actually Irwin's 12th box. This is Cook Spring, site of another stage station, at the entrance to one of the most dangerous places along the Butterfield Trail, Cook's Canyon. Fearing an attack by Confederates, Captain Isaiah Moore, commanding the evacuation from Buchanan, ordered all the wagons burned in order to facilitate a more rapid run to the Rio Grande. 30 years later, Irwin sued for the loss of his property. And you can see that he had some pretty neat stuff. A riding jacket, gold laced, leopard vest, fur cape. But he also had some valuable collections: Navajo, Apache, and other Indian warlike weapons, collection of animals, birds, reptiles, insects, minerals. He was probably most upset about all his personal papers and family heirlooms that were lost. Irwin made it across the plains traveling the Santa Fe Trail. In December 1861, he finally met Baird in Washington, D.C., and learned that the meteorite was lost somewhere in Mexico. In January, he joined the Civil War in the Western Theater with Grant and Sherman. At the Battle of Shiloh, he rode onto the battlefield with his sword drawn. He then established the first full-service field hospital. While Irwin was off fighting in the Civil War, his meteorite finally made it to Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, it did not receive the reception he expected. The Smithsonian Institution has just received an immense meteorite from California, which immediately attracts the attention of all who visit the museum. It is in the shape of a ring, the greatest diameter over 4 feet. It was presented to the institution by the Ainza family of California and will be known as the Ainza meteorite. Irwin immediately protested, and Spencer Baird proposed adding Irwin's name. In this 1867 picture, the meteorite is labeled the Irwin Ainza, but that only made Irwin more upset. Now his name would be forever tied to someone he considered to be a scoundrel. Irwin proposed just calling the meteorite the Tucson meteorite, and it would take 10 years, but he finally prevailed. The last word on the renaming controversy is this memo from 1956 confirming that the meteorite will be known as the Tucson meteorite. Irwin is buried at West Point next to his 9-month-old son, who died of diphtheria, and near his friend Custer. But his legacy will be the fact that he's still talked about in Arizona. In 2004, a report on the Santa Cruz River was published, and part of the background was a historical study by Barbara Tellman and Richard Yardy. And in this table, you can easily see the impact Irwin had on identifying natural history specimens in southern Arizona. And here's another example of Irwin's legacy. The article talks about Irwin and his Mexican jay. Despite Baird's pleading, Irwin never did succeed in getting an undamaged turkey specimen to the Smithsonian. This turkey is walking in front of the old corral near the cottonwood at Fort Buchanan. Questions? Someone asked how I was able to identify Irwin in the painting of the 7th Regiment. Among Irwin's papers in possession of the family was a copy of Leslie's newspaper from May 1906. In addition to stories of the San Francisco earthquake, the paper was celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 7th Regiment. And here was a picture of the 7th Regiment marching in Washington Square. Irwin had the habit of making notes in red pencil in the margins of things that he read, and he had made this notation when he was 77. I suspect he remembered his pivot position at the end of the second row. The newspaper picture is of a lithograph that is now in the New York Public Library. And here's the colorized lithograph from 1852. The artist of both the painting and the print was Otto Bettinger, a noted miniaturist. A notation on the print states that the heads are from daguerreotypes. So this is very likely a portrait of Irwin in his early 20s. Thank you very much.